Hi, I'm Anderson Brown, and today we're going to talk about Aristotle's philosophy of mind. Let me get my slideshow up here for you real fast. Go. Aristotle's philosophy of mind that is in the sense of the metaphysics of the mind-body relation, and really metaphysics, or if you wish, looking at our concepts that around what we think of as mental in the mind, our concepts around what we think of as body. That's why I say there on the title slide here, the startlingly modern conceptual analysis of De Anima. I think Aristotle isn't what a lot of people expect. What he is, though, is a philosopher who has a great deal in common with philosophers of mind of the 20th century, early 21st century. So I think that's something that's impressive. And I think this is one of the really core issues that Aristotle has to offer us in his philosophy. So let's take a look. Let's first of all put this in some kind of context, think a little bit about Aristotle's metaphysics. The first video in the series is my one on his text, The Physics. This is on this video right here is on his text De Anima. For historical reasons, we use the Latin name On the Soul, Sobre el Alma. Aristotle looked for a middle way between the form-matter dualism of Plato's academics. What's that? Form-matter dualism, that there are two different kinds of being, two different kinds of categories of being that exist independently of each other. Of course, that comes with a problem baked into it as to how those two kinds interact. And so Aristotle's between that, the form-matter dualism of Plato's academics, and the reductive materialism of Democritus's atomists. What does that mean? Well, Democritus thought that there was a bottom level of being, the atom swirling in the void, and that everything could ultimately be explained in terms of that bottom physical level of being. And that's something familiar to us, where a sort of popular notion of science might be that there's some sort of bottom level of physical explanation, and all the other things that we describe and explain can be translated or understood somehow in terms of that bottom level. Aristotle isn't that either. Aristotle doesn't agree with the reductive materialist claim. He wants, as I say, a middle way between what he saw as this promiscuous dualism of the form-matter dualists, we'll talk about a little more, and the reductivism of these materialists, these atomists. Second bullet point is ontology of primary being is unusual because it's complex. I mean, if you're thinking about what your theory of primary being is, a lot of people have the intuition this could be some simple, unanalyzable thing. But Aristotle in general tends to say that the cosmos as it is really is the datum. And he's not interested in making something complicated easy. His notion of primary being is substance. And okay, this is metaphysics says this is primary being, but it's a complex, it's a unity of form and matter. The idea is that form can only be found in matter, and matter is always found in some kind of form. So what's that middle way that Aristotle wanted between the metaphysical dualists, the Platonists, and these reductive materialists, the atomists? He wanted a kind of non-reductive materialism. Materialism in the sense that everything that we consider is a material thing of some kind or the other, non-reductive in the sense that all of its properties and everything that's happening, the changes that are happening, cannot be explained in terms of the contingent physical properties of the underlying stuff. Again, he's not in favor of reductive materialism. Now, and we're here today to talk about philosophy of mind. Is what we're going to mostly concern with, and whether or not Aristotle manages to succeed with his theory of substance as this complex of form and matter in giving us what is really a kind of non-reductive materialism, I think is something that's debatable, and that's part of what's interesting. There's lots of stuff to debate and think about in terms of, among other things, ancient Greek philosophy, as well as philosophy in general. So it's not just a question of sort of learning what someone said, but rather you get up to these issues, you can walk up to the issues and sort of see what different people say about them and think about them for yourself. That's what it is. So does Aristotle manage to steer a middle way between Platonic dualism and atomistic reduction? Well, that's something that's debatable, but that's what he wants to do, and that has everything to do with his analysis of mind. Last bullet point. In his text, The Physics, Aristotle describes change as the flowing of form through matter. Unlike Plato, Aristotle sees form as a process rather than a non-material example of being. Um, there's some people will allow you to describe Aristotle as maybe a process philosopher, others will not. I don't really need to get into that. I would say it looks to me like Aristotle conceives of the cosmos as more of like an event than like a thing. So I'm not sure about what it means to say one is a process philosopher, but I would entertain the proposition that the right way to characterize the cosmos itself is as an event rather than an object. And I think in Aristotle, and you see in his physics, where he's trying to explain change, and that is, after all, his project there, I think you see that his question is all about the dynamics. So two examples of substance, because Aristotle, unlike Democritus, who says, well, everything's made out of these atoms down at the bottom, right? Aristotle isn't really interested in giving us a blanket or universal account of what substance is. He thinks that there are some things which are better examples of substance, more examples of the unity of form and matter than others. And he does talk about sort of what is sometimes translated as heaps, random things that aren't really any kind of object or categorizable as objects. The same question about predication, about saying that something is a thing, is discussed in the technical late dialogues of Plato, also in a very interesting way. All right, and anyway, first bullet point is two basic examples of substance that are organisms. That's really what he's mostly thinking about, I think. And then functional artifacts, that is things made by humans, which fit in very well with his theory of substance. We want to get at, is it just a theory that just sits there? No. Why does he say that this is a good way of characterizing nature? Let's get to that. Second bullet point. If Aristotle were alive today, I think he really probably would be a biologist. I think he'd be in a biology department. He spent most of his working adult life out in the field, actually studying tidal pools and all kinds of things. He was just a natural born naturalist, I guess. For him, the paradigmatic example of substance was animal organisms. And that's really important in terms of understanding Aristotle's philosophy of mind, his analysis of the concept of mind. In organisms, each organ is defined in terms of its function in the whole. Okay, so imagine that you had an organ from a body and you were looking at it, you're giving a physical description, and you said, well, it's 8 pounds and it's red and it's made out of muscle and has 4 chambers and so on. But you don't know what it is until you know that it's a heart, una bomba, a pump, something that's pushing the blood. That is, until you have not the physical description of the thing, but the functional description of the thing. An artificial heart is every bit as much a heart, right, in as much as it performs exactly the same function. And not only that, but notice this, we often tend to think, if we don't like the idea of reductive materialism and scientific reductivism, it's standard, isn't it, to think that, well, there's a block to that at the level of psychology. You can't reduce from human psychological phenomenon down to some underlying physical phenomenon. But Aristotle gives us a block to material reduction at the level of biology. And I think this is a really important point. It still is an important point in philosophy of biology today, in fact. And that is that you don't know as he would say, the what is it, right? What is this thing? And again, remember, reductive materialism would say, well, do all your physical description, and that's what it is. But Aristotle says, no, that's wrong. You don't know what this is until you understand its function, the function that it performs. And notice the function that it performs is something that's understood in this larger concept of the organism. So notice that against the atomists, it's not the case that you explain the organism in terms of all of its organs. Rather, that's backwards. You understand each organ in terms of its function in the larger organism. Still on that second bullet point there, think of that as sort of backwards causation. Aristotle has a very wide notion of causation, but backwards causation, that is explaining this phenomenon, you have to appeal to something in the future, what this is aiming at. Explaining the tool, the human tool, requires you to explain what someone's going to use it for, its aim, its function. And then, this is important, this is the last sentence on the second bullet point, Aristotle thinks the whole cosmos is a functional whole like that. Notice that, that's key. So you've got the organism, and then you've got the organ, which is a part of the organism. You can only understand the organ in terms of its role in the larger organism. Now you've got the cosmos, everything that exists, and you've got all the individual things that are in the cosmos or that compose the cosmos. You only understand the individual thing in terms of the function that it performs in the larger cosmos, which is not obvious, right? Well, I mean, that is to say what that function is. And that's getting at what there is of Aristotle's theology, his notion of maybe divinity. Last bullet point. Human-built artifacts are also very useful examples of substance. They are genuine examples of substance, unities of form and matter. The humans are the efficient cause. Bob the builder is the efficient cause. He gets all the bricks and concrete. That's the material cause. He has the plan for the house. That's his formal cause. And the people living in the house sheltered from the rain and the darkness. And that's the final cause. Again, substances are the two basic examples are organisms and artifacts. And in the same way that human artifacts aim at a function, Aristotle's thesis is that the whole universe has some sort of function too. It's a very holistic picture. That is, understanding any one thing in the universe, you have to understand it's part of the whole ultimately. Okay, so Aristotle, again, the anti-reductivist. The atomist, and by the way, this might look technical. I think this is very useful in understanding contemporary philosophy of mind. One thing in contemporary philosophy of mind, you get people who think that they're naturalists, and they talk about the brain being a sort of now as a little person up in the head, right? The brain has been sort of swapped out for the Cartesian soul. And so he's, oh, I'm a naturalist. I don't think there's an immaterial soul that's the real me making the decisions and so on. I think it's my brain. That's the little person up in the head now. Let's look at what's wrong with that kind of language, that kind of moving a little too quick when you're trying to be a naturalist. The atomists, and before them, Zeno, Eleatics, when he says, right, that you can't walk across the floor because you first have to walk across half of it, but first you have to walk across half of it and so on. The atomists and Zeno and the Eleatics made a logical argument. There had to be a bottom level of reality, the atoms, on the grounds that there were not infinite sets in nature, right? That was the idea. It couldn't be divided infinitely. Aristotle agrees that there aren't any infinite sets in nature. I don't know if he's right or not about that, but he thinks it's true. But Aristotle saw that division itself was a formal convention. In other words, here's the critique of Zeno, the paradoxes of Zeno. Zeno says you can't walk across the classroom floor because you're going to have to walk across the first half of it. It's a fallacy of equivocation. Remember, I described Aristotle as a thoroughly modern sort of, he's doing conceptual analysis. He's always thinking about language and the way that people are using words. So, right, so so the equivocation here is on two senses of dividing. Let's use me for the example like I do there in the first bullet point. You can divide me into 6 feet of height or however many inches that is. That's your heuristic. You've got some reason why you have this functional scale there where you've divided me up into these units, these conventional units of yours. And similarly, the floor of the classroom can be divided that way too, into the first half and the first quarter and so on. But although you can divide me in that sense into 6 different feet, I'm 6 feet tall, you can't divide me physically. That is, you can cut me in half, but then I'm not going to be me anymore. And guess what? The classroom floor isn't the classroom floor anymore if you cut it in half either. That is, we're talking about the whole floor. Okay. And that is, so that's important. That's Aristotle's critique. Notice it's Zeno's paradoxes, but that's also his critique of the later atomists. But then also notice how that relates to the second bullet point on the slide. Aristotle's critique of the mere logical fallacy, the fallacy of confusing the sum of the parts with the whole. Remember, I started off discussing the slide saying, look, you hear a lot of people now, they're talking about the brain is the little brain and the head is the one that's recognized the patterns and producing the speech and has the plans and so on. You still got another little person inside the head. Intentional attributions. What are intentional attributions? That sounds fancy. I just mean when I describe and explain people's behavior in terms of their beliefs, their desires, their hopes, their fears, and so on. Just exactly the way you do and we all do all the time. That's all I mean by it. So these intentional attributions, when I say about you or me or myself or anybody else, that we have beliefs, or we have desires or hopes or fears or intentions or suspicions and so on. We're talking about whole embodied persons, all right? A whole embodied person believes and desires. A whole embodied person has projects, recognizes patterns, solves problems, comprehends speech, and so on. These are things that whole embodied persons do in environments, and that's important because it's incoherent to talk about them being in these states outside of any environment. And brains do not think or feel or solve problems or have goals and so forth any more than these non-existent Cartesian souls did. So, so again, that's important because you get a preliminary take on trying to be a naturalist, but thinking that the brain is now the little person head, which is not explanatory. And not only that, but it's pernicious. Um, but in any event, this block to material reduction at the level of biology is very central to Aristotle's philosophy of mind, Aristotle's psychology. Aristotle is not a Cartesian. That's the most interesting thing about him. What is a Cartesian, roughly speaking? It's after Descartes, although Descartes himself was a pretty good philosopher and might not have been guilty of this. But a Cartesian is someone who thinks that there's a soul, which is a non-physical thing. There's some kind of mental substance, like Descartes talked about it, that was a real substance, but it wasn't a physical substance, didn't have physical properties, but did have non-physical properties. A dualist notion that there's something like a soul that might survive, for example, independently of the body or after the death of the body, or switch bodies, and all the rest of that. The Cartesian soul kind of there observing sort of the world, but not really in the world, not really part of the body. Aristotle isn't a Cartesian at all. In general, the ancient Greeks, of course, they're 1,000 years almost 2,000 years before Descartes. Um, Plato also is very interesting on this point. But with Aristotle, as I said in that title slide, is strikingly modern. He's really not a Cartesian at all. And that is not something to take for granted. First bullet point, Homer, for example, Greek popular culture in general, are full of references to the souls leaving the body and going to Hades and so on. This idea that there's sort of a non-physical spirit that kind of animated the flesh. I sort of always think of those claymation movies when I read them talking about that. It's a kind of commonplace sort of thing. And Plato too, because remember, Plato is a form matter dualist. Okay, so, and he thinks that mental properties like grasping logical relations and cognition are more part of the formal level of a human being than the material one. And he does at the end of the Republic, at the end of Book 10 of the Republic, talk about the souls transmigrating upwards and downwards, much as in Hindu theology, because of the kinds of lives that they've lived. So the point of those two bullet points in the slide there is that Aristotle isn't coming from some place where nobody has any ideas that we can identify as sort of like Cartesian ideas. Lots of people in the ancient Greek world believed in souls and spirits and ghosts and all that stuff. Aristotle, no, third bullet point. Aristotle is a naturalist, a monist through and through. A monist, not a dualist, doesn't do ghosts and goblins, doesn't do angels and demons. On his analysis, psychological language refers to biological processes, making psychological descriptions. This person has these beliefs and these desires and these intentions is a kind of description of a biological process that's going on that aims at the fulfillment of the living organism, right? So psychological descriptions are a type of dynamic descriptions of living bodies. And really the thing here that I think is good, by the way, I won't hide that preference. It seems to me that what you really want to talk about is life. And that's important also in the discussions of artificial intelligence and other kinds of examples, right? It looks as if what you're talking about in terms of having a soul or having a mind is really a being that's alive, that has a project, that has to have intentions, that has to move forward, that has to process information, and so on. And so I think that one of the biggest problems with Cartesian dualism about the mind and the body is this divorce that it makes between our notions about what the mental is and our notions about life and being alive and being a living organism. I think that's exactly wrong. So psyche, this word psyche. In the Anima, Aristotle's thinking of psyche as any self-caused movement or internally caused movement. So for example, right now I'm moving my body, I'm moving my vocal cords, and I'm making noises, and I'm just moving around in my chair. That's movement that's coming from within my body. Notice growth, though, of being growing. That's also movement coming from within the body. Versus what? Versus, well, some quotidian, I mean, my body can be moved around by other things. Aristotle, for example, thinks that magnetized rocks have psyche because they cause iron filings to arrange themselves in the magnetic field pattern, and that looks like some kind of self-caused movement. So he does actually say that. Second bullet point, then, these movements, right, of psyche, these motions or change that comes from within. That's really what he means by psyche. Include reproduction, growth, the development of traits, and these are the elements of soul. He means psyche, shared with all organisms, including plants. Do animals have minds according to Aristotle? Yes, they do. But Aristotle's notion of mind, as is typical for him on a lot of notions, I mentioned causation, is very broad. It's broader than our convention would be. And still in the second bullet point, animals share all these elements in common with plants, as well as locomotion. Of course, they're not rooted in one place, and related abilities. And by the way, as I say there, and I mentioned before, he's a biologist. He's a careful and thorough zoologist. He doesn't just make this stuff up. If he says something like that, he's observed carefully to check all of his claims. Third bullet point, humans then share all these elements with the non-speaking animals, as well as rationality, intentional action, including speaking, that we describe as believing, desiring, fearing, and so on. It's just a further extension of the kinds of abilities that we see in non-human animals, which is just a further extension of the kinds of abilities that we see in plants. It's all strictly, also, last sentence on the slide there, strictly operational. These intentional descriptions just refer to, on Aristotle's view, behavioral traits. He doesn't, again, he's not a Cartesian. He doesn't think there's anything other than behavioral traits, okay? So as I was talking about mind and life, rather than conceiving of mind as something distinct from body, as Descartes and the rationalist tradition in general do with their deism and other motives, Aristotle conceives of mental language as a kind of formal description of an organism. Mental language, so I'm talking about myself and other people in terms of their beliefs and desires and thoughts and feelings and so on. It's a formal, what does formal mean? Not logical form or something like that, or notation, but rather formal, just in the sense I'm talking about. This is a being that's going through this process. It's the nature of the being. Unlike the static idealized ontology of matter-independent form found in Plato. Again, Plato, there's Platonic heaven, right? Where the form exists in its perfect, unruffled, serene perfection for all eternity. That's what I mean. And Aristotle would have none of that unobservable world of eternal perfection. He thought that was intellectually promiscuous, or that is ontologically promiscuous in the extreme. Aristotle defines the form of an organism as identical to the life cycle of the organism, not the shape of the adult animal, but rather the process that is constituted by, from the fertilized embryo to the fully mature animal and the end of its life cycle. Both animal species and types of artifacts can only be understood as processes aimed at some realization, which also means they can only be understood functionally. That is, again, a physical description about the contingent physical parts isn't going to cut it. You need a functional description, and a functional description is going to have to appeal to things in the future, the function that's going to be performed, which is the cause that's pulling from the future, see? So last bullet point, and I'm not the only one who talks about this. I've mentioned once or twice Martha Nussbaum, an excellent, one of our best living philosophers. She has a series of really good publications on this. Aristotle is very close here to Wittgenstein, who understands mental functions to be aspects and reflections of a particular form of life. I'll give Kant credit. Kant understands this too. You have a certain kind of body, certain kinds of senses. The reason you're having these kinds of experiences because you have that kind of body, those kinds of senses. It's not a generic universal God's eye consciousness or awareness or understanding that you have. It's very specific, and it's tailor-made to an organism with a body like you have that needs to survive, that has the physical imperatives that you do. Wittgenstein even questions Platonic accounts of the metaphysics of mathematics along these lines. Empiricists always try and take a crack at the metaphysics of mathematics. I'm not sure. I think that's hard. I get Platonic intuitions about mathematics. But yeah, Wittgenstein and Aristotle similar in that their understanding, for example, speech as something that is functional has to be understood functionally in terms of what it is that that behavior is aiming at. It's not just some sort of disembodied soul making oracular pronouncements about the world from some sort of detached space. That's not something that human beings are the kinds of beings who are capable of doing. What is the telos of the human being? When I was first learning about functionalism, studying philosophy of mind a long time ago, I got confused right off the bat with this. Because, I don't have a very good attitude. And I thought, well, human beings don't have a damn function. So let's look at that. First bullet point. Artifacts have obvious functions, and organs are defined by their functions in the larger organism, as we talked about. But what's the function of the organism itself? And Aristotle, second bullet point, has two answers to this. The aim, or the telos, la meta, the goal, the function of an organism is to fulfill itself with a flourishing, complete life cycle, basically. And that's, complicated by ecosystemic interactions. Acorns do lots more than just grow into trees, okay? But basically, if you want to know the form of an organism, that, again, it's not what an adult one looks like. It's not a picture from Natural Resources Department. No, it's the process. Think of an animal as an event, right? But then number two, more to our more abstract and philosophical point right here, the cosmos itself, he says, as I said before, is a teleological whole, such that the things that make up the cosmos are each one functional parts of the whole, defined just as organs are. Remember, the organ is defined by its function. The heart is defined by the fact that it's a pump. That's what makes it a heart, and so on. And Aristotle's suggestion is that every part of the universe is like that, can only be understood if we understand the contribution, the functional contribution it's making to some future realization. What is that in the case of the cosmos? I don't know. Again, that gets into something like his theology. Aristotle says, last bullet point, first line of his Politics, that man is the rational animal. That's the trait that distinguishes humans. Elephants have big trunks and birds fly. Okay. Grasping inferential relationships and being able to symbolize them, let's say, is a human trait. Let's say that's what rationality is a human trait that emerges continuously from the more basic animal traits. He makes this very clear. It's a continuity thesis. It's the opposite of mind-body dualist thesis. There is a smooth continuity between non-human animals and humans. There's smooth continuity between, say, mammalian fauna and flora. As usual, last sentence on the slide, Aristotle seeks to describe nature as he finds it. The cosmos is the datum for Aristotle. He starts with the surface and works from there. Okay, so he says this is what we find. This is the nature of people. So let's talk about our conclusions. And I think that makes it, clear enough. I kind of really didn't want to get lost in the weeds too much here, and I hope that I've been crisp. First bullet point, Aristotle's approach eliminates non-physical Cartesian minds or souls altogether. He doesn't think there are any things like that. And that makes him very similar to a lot of, late 20th, early 20th century people, not just philosophers, but people in science and cognitive science in general. And Aristotle, again, he's not a Cartesian. He doesn't think there's some sort of non-physical soul at all. Second bullet point, he conceives of psychology as a further level of biological complexity, and psychological descriptions as a kind of biological descriptions. And I really do suspect he may be right in that. And then adding another point, this is where we're going to go in the next two videos. I'm going to do the Poetics and the Nicomachean Ethics. Third bullet point, on Aristotle's view of the human condition, people should try to realize their finest potential. That is, what should you do if you want to be a good person, the best person you can be? And Aristotle, especially with Plato, it's a little abstract because he thinks to be the best person you can be is to be the maximally the most rational being you can be. But Aristotle says you should try to be the best specimen of the kind of biological organism that you are. And you say, well, why? Well, because here we are. I say the human condition, our condition, here we are. This is our life. Now, what are we going to do? And Plato and Aristotle, this is Greek virtue theory, right? They both say, really, well, here we are. So, what are you going to do to maximize your life? Well, you ought to try and be the best example of the kind of being that you are, that you possibly can be. Why? Because you have some duty? Maybe, but really more to the point, because that's the way, if you do fulfill your potential, you will be maximally happy. That's the way to be the happiest kind of person. Both Plato and Aristotle think that. That's really technically more what we mean when we say that Greek philosophy is about how to live the good life. They're quite literal about that. Last bullet point on the slide there, then, Aristotle's aesthetics as developed in the poetic. Sorry. Sees aesthetic experience as the development of insights and abilities that enhance those developed by ordinary experience. And again, he's thinking mostly about drama. Uh, that is, and we're going to go into this in the video on the Anima, that when we're watching the drama and the tragedy, say, and we see people put into horrific situations and feeling emotions and going through experiences that we ourselves in our more sheltered lives and the characters in the play haven't experienced. And what is the function of that for us? It helps us to practice and think about how we would react, what kind of emotional responses we would have in those kinds of situations. And that sort of roughly is take, but we're going to talk about that quite a bit more in the discussion of the poetics. So anyway, just trying, the big takeaway, he's not a dualist. He's got a thoroughly monistic, thoroughly naturalistic, downright biological theory of mind. And I think that makes Aristotle really pretty impressive. This is written during the 4th century, the 300s, uh, during the cusp of the end of the High Greek period and the beginning of the Hellenic period, and the Alexandrian conquest at the end of the 4th century. So he's quite amazing that way. And again, as I say, I thank you for your attention. And I hope it was worthwhile to you. And maybe you might want to watch some of the other videos on Aristotle and other stuff. But if you do, it's great. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And I shall see you soon if I can figure out how to. Oh, yeah, there's a little button. Okie dokie.